Great. All right, thank you so much, Lisa. So now we'd like to provide you with a little bit of context about the work that's been done in Minnesota and the networked improvement communities. So give you some background as well as walk you through the timeline of implementation. So in 2018, we partnered with stakeholders at the Minnesota Department of Education to develop a project to support the improvement specifically of graduation rates at alternative programs or state-approved alternative programs in Minnesota. So as you'll see on the slide, historically, graduation rates for SAPs, state-approved alternative programs, have fallen behind the graduation rates at traditional high schools. This also holds true as we look over 5- and 6-year cohorts. So this was identified as an area where the state of Minnesota really wanted us to put some effort as REL Midwest. In order to support growth in graduation rates at SAPs in Minnesota, REL Midwest worked in collaboration with MDE, Minnesota Department of Education, to develop and facilitate 2 networked improvement communities, or NICs. This project spanned over 3 years and includes pre and after the COVID-19 pandemic. As state approved, I'll answer some questions when we get to the question and answer, so sorry. So in year 1, we developed a NIC of state-approved alternative programs in urban areas around Minneapolis and St. Paul that included 5 schools. In year 2, we continued that work with the NIC, and we also established a virtual NIC with rural schools, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about these NICs in a minute. And then we're now in year 3, where we're using a train the trainer model to support their capacity to continue the work after the REL Midwest facilitation is done. So these NICs were all driven by the same problem statement that was established by the NIC members in collaboration with REL Midwest facilitators. And the problem statement that they came up with was they are not successfully reshaping the habits, developing the life and academic skills, and teaching the knowledge that students need to achieve personal success. This problem statement drives the work of the NIC. The aim statement also drives the work of the NIC, and this was also agreed upon and established by NIC members to increase graduation rates in their schools by 20% over the 3 years. I did want to just quickly share that we had a highlight moment last year. So in February 2021, REL researchers shared that one of our NIC schools had actually seen a 27% increase in students completing more credits, putting them closer to graduation. So definitely seeing progress towards our aim statement, which is very exciting. So a little bit more context about our NICs. In year 1, we established what we called sort of this suburban urban NIC in the St. Paul, Minneapolis areas. It included 5 schools. You'll see their names up there on the screen. 5 administrators, 34 teachers, and the NIC sessions were all in person at that point. This was pre-COVID. In the first year, they focused on a goal-setting intervention that I'll share a little bit about in a few minutes, but also mindfulness and social and emotional learning interventions were priorities to meet their aim statement. In year 2, again, we continued on with the NIC schools. By this point, we had some attrition, so 2 schools participated, both administrators at the schools, and 1 school actually increased the number of teachers participating in the NIC, so rounded out to 13 teachers. This was all virtual this past year because of the COVID-19 pandemic environment. In this year, they continue to do goal-setting activity as well as scaffolding on another intervention or change idea called Sparks. I won't go into that today, but you can certainly look it up online. This was focused also on developing the capacity of these schools to continue to do PDSA cycles. In the second year, simultaneously, my colleague Courtney Rowland led a virtual NIC of rural alternative learning programs and alternative learning centers. So there was 3 ALCs or ALPs that were part of this NIC that included 4 administrators, 9 teachers, and this was all virtual. However, this NIC was always planned to be virtual even before the COVID-19 pandemic, just to sort of make it easier for rural schools to participate. They didn't have to gather in person and spend that time traveling. They also focused on the goal-setting intervention and social and emotional learning. So we just wanted to share a little bit about the goal-setting intervention that both of these NICs used. in their time with us. So this is an example of their change idea, their strategy of goal setting. Goal setting is an evidence-based practice. It's a strategy to improve student learning, improve student and teacher relationships, and clarify expectations for students and teachers, as well as promote development of a growth mindset for students. The strategy itself is student-driven. It's focused on setting small, achievable academic goals or educational goals for students. It includes student and teacher discussion of the goals and reflection on their progress. And it also includes regular intervals where students reflect on their own process. This is a very simple yet very powerful intervention for students. It supports SEL, it supports clarification around goals and expectations for students and teachers, and fosters that growth mindset. The example that you see on your screen is actually just a tool that some of our schools use to help with the intervention. So I don't want to confuse anybody that the goal setting sheet you see in front of you is not the intervention, it was the process of goal setting itself. So now I'm going to turn it to Courtney to share some of our big takeaways.
Thanks, Dominique. Good afternoon, everybody. I am here to share some reflections and lessons learned from the virtual NIC that Dom just described. So this is the one that took place last year during the epic 2020-2021 school year. So we had, as Dominique said, 3 area learning centers from rural areas of Minnesota participating in this NIC. And our aim, just to give you a quick sense of what we were working on together, our aim focused on improving graduation rates, and more specifically for this context, which was an important adjustment that we made as a team up front, was improving rates of credit recovery, accrual, and completion. So that was the specific language in our aim. And then, as Dom said, we worked on goal setting as our change idea. So in a little bit, you're going to hear more specifics about this NIC when we open up the panel discussion with 2 of the participants. But in the meantime, what I want to share with you now, and what's on the screen here, is just some overall reflections and lessons learned that that we took away from the year-long experience. And these points are actually described in more detail in a blog that I think is going to be put in the chat box for you. So we wrote a blog post at the end of the NIC last year, and you can see more detail in that link. So these reflections represent some of the most salient things for us that emerged at the end of the year, but there's certainly a larger range of lessons learned and considerations when designing and implementing a NIC. These were just our main takeaways. So number 1 here, the first thing to share about is this idea of communicating and understanding NIC expectations up front. So I'm really going to get into the nuts and bolts of designing and implementing a NIC here. So I've learned, and I think this will resonate with others, that in improvement work that I've engaged in with schools or with districts or different teams, that it's really important to be concrete at the front end about what the work requires. So doing the rapid cycle testing of change ideas and using data to monitor progress in a disciplined way, the way that Alicia described, it is a new way of doing work for many. And it requires time, and it sometimes requires a different sort of structure for how we collaborate and reflect than is what's currently available in the school day. So we have to sort of think about that differently. So I think that's why it's important to be clear about that up front, both for those that are doing the lift of the change idea, which is often teachers, and for the leaders in schools and school systems that need to sort of create and support and facilitate the space for these folks to engage in the work. So for example, you might show NIC participants really early on a draft of a PDSA form and be clear about what a trial is and how often they will need to implement the change idea and collect data and reflect on it. So being clear about these things up front is really, really vital. It might seem too in the weeds for early discussions when you're just pulling a NIC together, but I promise you, especially for busy teachers and school leaders and administrators, they sort of crave clarity right away about how is this going to look and how is this going to affect my work. So that's the first lesson learned that I wanted to share with you all. Second, the sort of center part of the slide, supporting the ideal conditions for a successful NIC is essential. We found in this particular NIC that teachers were more likely to engage in the process when school leaders, and this is sort of related to what I was saying a minute ago, when school leaders provided time and support for people to participate in the activities, including time for planning, time for collecting data with integrity, and engaging in meaningful reflection. And having that kind of support and carved out time actually helps to sustain the PDSA work even after, you know, like after REL has exited the situation, for example, REL Midwest. It makes it become sort of a way of doing work, which is an important transition in this. It can't feel like it's one more thing that is not integrated into the existing practices and strategies. So some of the other strategies we use to support ideal conditions, you can see the sub-bullets there, emphasize the importance of using evidence, not hunches, to inform decision-making, co-designing the improvement measures with the team, and sort of meeting NIC members where they're at when it comes to measurement, data collection, and data reflection. So for that first sub-bullet, and this is something that I think Brad and Alyssa really honed in on when we did our work together, the data collection part of the PDSA work and looking over the data together in team meetings and conversations was sort of a game changer. And I think that's part of something we realized in our work. It can sometimes feel challenging because it's a new way of doing work, but with helpful tools and templates, it's important and a doable part of the process. We also found that co-designing the improvement measures was a helpful part of doing a NIC. So for example, we developed the language, you know, Alicia was talking about those measurement tools or rubrics or exit tickets, different ways of doing practical measurement around the change ideas. We would design the language around those measurement tools with our NIC members to make it more, more aligned with the audience, more user-centered. And then last, I think it's okay to ease into this work. You know, we started our NIC, this virtual NIC by just doing the plan and do components with some light reflections at first, and then we strengthened the measurement and the study and act components over time. So real quickly, let me just say before we transition over to the, see if you have any questions and transition over to the panel. The final takeaway from our NIC, if you could just go back one slide, please, are really these notions of having a continuous learning mindset and cultivating and relying on relationships. This kind of work only happens when we have a continuous improvement mindset, both for ourselves and our own practice and for our students. So we have to believe and be open to this space for improvement. So I just wanted to wrap up with those takeaways and lessons learned from our virtual NIC. I'm sure Alyssa and Brad will share more during the panel, and you all may have similar additional takeaways from your improvement work. I think, Dom, do we have a couple minutes for some questions?
We do have a couple minutes.
Okay.
We have some questions for each of us. So I'll address a couple questions directed at my presentation. So what is a state-approved alternative program? This is something that exists in Minnesota. They have to be approved to meet the educational needs of these specific students. So it's just a technical term, but it's essentially alternative learning programs and centers that can work in very different ways, but serve the same population of students. Somebody asked for more information on goal setting. Goal setting is an evidence-based strategy in the What Works Clearinghouse, and there is actually a practice guide that lives on the What Works Clearinghouse website that I can try and chase down during this presentation for you. But that's a great strategy, been very effective for our schools for sure. And then Courtney, we have a question for you. And actually, I guess this could be for both of us. So in what ways did technology support data collection and data review across multiple members of the NIC? Do you want to go first with that one?
Sure, that's a good question. Here are a couple things that come to mind right away, Kim. So collecting the data can be burdensome sometimes. So we built an Excel spreadsheet with Alyssa and Brad and the other NIC members that they could use to quickly collect the data in the moment around the goal setting and document what they were getting. They use texting. They might tell you a little bit more about it to communicate with their students to implement the goal setting process and do some of their check-ins. We used Google Forms and would text for the exit survey or the quick student survey, we would text the Google form directly to the students. So we had to sort of remove the frictions and remove the barriers to getting the data and getting it quickly and making it accessible to people. And so we used technology the best we could for that. And then one more thing I'll just say, because part of your question was around making meaning of the data or data analysis. Our team would often take the data that the schools would push out and create some tables and graphs and bring those to our PDSA meetings so that we could sort of make sense of things together. So there are a lot of nice options for quickly creating charts and graphs that we would use to make sense of the practical measures data.
Mm-hmm. And our suburban NIC, similarly, especially during COVID, used some similar strategies as Courtney described, of having sort of like the quick surveys and exit tickets and things. We also would take time during our full network meetings to have teams share how they were doing data collection. We had some teams that came up with some pretty creative ways of automating data collection into like shared Google Drives or shared spreadsheets. So we made that a part of like that cross learning. And similar to, again, what Courtney said, like making a focus as a facilitator of really working with the teachers to figure out what is the best way for them to collect data in a way that fits into their daily work, and really makes it a practical measure to collect. And, how do you integrate those systems better? So even as the PDSA cycles, keep going, you continue to refine those collection measures too, and figure out new ways to use data. Certainly during the pandemic, Jamboards were a big tool that we used in terms of data reflection, so that people could collaborate across schools and in different locations. Okay, I think we have time to answer one more question. So the work I'm doing with districts in need of assistance for SPP indicators, they weren't reaching out for support. My aim of doing this work is in a more meaningful way, leveraging staff knowledge, collaborating with them, and creating tools doesn't always work. There are contractual union parameters that makes it hard to collaborate. How do you make more of it with a NIC setup? I'll speak to that point quickly and then turn it over to you, Courtney, to respond as well. So often what we would do as facilitators is we would show them some examples that we would create, and then we'd all sort of reflect together. So we took on some of that work of development, but it was really like just to kind of shorten the time that we needed to spend on it. And then incorporating the sharing as we went, as they used the tools and started to develop them on their own. So it's kind of how we got around that time commitment thing. I think the time for collaboration is so important, and it's so fundamental in a NIC. It's part of what actually moves progress towards meeting that aim, is that opportunity to share. So I think any kind of work you can do as a facilitator sort of beforehand without really taking, control away from the NIC, but adding those tools and giving them some ideas to reflect on rather than putting the onus on them to generate things from scratch. So that would be, my thoughts on it. Courtney?
Yeah, I'm hearing more in the question, the sort of how do I embed this in our work in a meaningful way without outside support. And it's interesting because in a couple of the projects that I'm working on now, we are trying to think about how this work sustains after outside groups like us exit. And some of the ideas that are on the table right now are finding the role in the system that can really be the owner of this work. There are lots of tools and resources and templates out there to find to sort of design it and customize it the way you might want to in your system, but having someone sort of own it in the work. So for us in one of our districts, it's going to be school leaders, teacher leaders, and instructional coaches. So they actually have continuous improvement work now embedded in their roles and responsibilities in order to carry some of these strategies forward as part of their day-to-day work. And I think it'll happen in the PLCs. So I think it's also about finding different ways to use PLC time that's more NIC focused. That's just a couple ideas that come to mind.